Hi, my name is Celeste Goodson. I am a medical exercise specialist. We're discussing postpartum, return to sport, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by the fantastic team and even better product at Earshot's Bluetooth headphones. These headphones are not for anyone. They are for runners and cyclists who charge. And of course, today's show is also brought to you by the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership via Patreon, where you can support the production of the show and in return receive access to our live stream events complimentary. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. And of course we do this across a range of our different episodes, interest editions, coaches corners, catch-up episodes, featured performers and expert editions. And following last week's featured performer episode featuring New Zealand multi-sport champion Dougal Allen, this week we jump over to a very important expert edition around all things helping females get back to sport and exercise postpartum. Get set for a heap of learnings today with featured guest, US-based medical exercise specialist Celeste Goodson. By way of bio, Celeste has been helping change the way women and elite athletes recover postpartum since 2009. Celeste is the founder of Recore Fitness and the Fit Splint device, a wonderful device to support women pre and postpartum. Now, as a physiotherapist, I know that this area sadly still lacks a lot of attention and expertise. Hence why I felt today it was so important to bring you the learnings that you'll receive from Celeste with this expert edition, Postpartum Return to Sport. And during today's conversation, you'll hear Celeste share around how pregnant women move differently, why it's important to take a proactive approach postpartum and not just wait for an issue to potentially develop. Celeste explains the musculoskeletal changes that occur through pregnancy and why rebuilding is not only for those with obvious problems such as diastasis recti, prolapse, stress incontinence, etc. Celeste outlines why it's important and when it's important to see a pelvic floor physiotherapist, basic postpartum building blocks, and Celeste overcomes the myths around this area, and there's plenty, and of course issues a very practical physical challenge for the week. So get ready with your pen and paper. This is an expert edition for coaches, athletes, and practitioners. Here is my conversation with Celeste Goodson, medical exercise specialist, on all things postpartum return to sport. Celeste Goodson, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Celeste, your expertise around all things changing the way women recover from childbirth is something that I think's been long overdue on this show, which was designed to help people perform at their physical best. And I think it's been an oversight to date to we've featured some women's health experts prior, but this is a real deep dive around this myth-busting best practices to help women get back, whether they're, as per your caseload, whether they're elites or recreational athletes. So really excited to dive into this.
Yeah, I'm excited to share some tips. And I think I mentioned it before, you're the first guy who's done an interview with me. It's usually women podcasts. But I do coach a lot of runners, and it's very applicable to the running coaches who work with any female athlete. So I'm super excited to reach out this way as well.
Celeste, maybe just a little bit of context. Your bio we've addressed, but what took you into this area of specialization and interest? I mean, what's your background? What's the interest here?
So I got my bachelor's in exercise science and started working in gyms as a personal trainer. Ended up, having 3 kids of my own. And by the time I had my second, I started specializing in training pre- and postnatal women. By the time I had my third, I started having some difficulties recovering. And I thought I knew what I should be doing as a trainer and understood everything, but there was a lot I did not know. Was never educated on the pelvic floor. And I was told I needed surgery for prolapse. And that was something that was a struggle for myself to return to run. This was 7 months postpartum. I was struggling to return to run. So, I went back to the drawing board and felt like I just needed to do a better job of strengthening the core and pelvic floor. And within several months of that, the symptoms improved greatly. And I was able to return to run and not have surgery. And so at the time, people were, OBGYNs were, and still today, telling some women that prolapse cannot be improved unless they do surgery. And that's just not true. And so there's just a lot that can be done postpartum to help women improve their symptoms and get back to returning to run or returning to sport.
Whether that's jumping, pushing things, pulling things, or running, whatever it may be. They say that research is me search, and it's certainly, it's beneficial to have had your own personal experiences. It's not just head knowledge then, is it? I mean, you mentioned you were having difficulty recovering after your third child. Yeah. Does that tie in with one of your recent posts about your iron levels as well? Like, this is not just pelvic floor, or is that separate?
Yeah, the iron levels was just something that really went undetected for a long time for me. That I never had a doctor tell me I needed to take iron until I was pregnant, but they were concerned about it when you're pregnant. So they say take it while you're pregnant, but it's never something they looked at after each pregnancy. And so doctors really do need to be following up with postpartum women and seeing what their iron levels are postpartum as well, because that is a huge factor in fatigue, obviously. And we all know as coaches how important iron levels are in performance.
Yeah, absolutely. Celeste, you've seen the need for greater education, awareness, and input for women postpartum returning to sport and activity and just health. Obviously, you've been through the journey. Maybe we start, with this. As a practitioner, I hear some real doozies when it comes to myths about what should and shouldn't be done. And by no means am I expertised in this area, but I mean, what are some of the top myths that you see or hear or observe around women returning to activity postpartum, Celeste?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fear-based tactics that ab separation or diastasis recti has to close in order to function well, and that's not true. Another myth is to never do crunches again. Another myth is no planks until your ab separation has healed. I know there's a bunch.
I've put you on the spot here, Celeste.
Yeah, no, it's okay. That's several big ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know how hard the myths can be. You deal with them every day in your professional life and rebut them and educate people. But then when you put on the spot, I've been in that situation. You're like, there's like 20. But let's work through these. The rectus diastasis. And just for people that may not be familiar with that term, what is that, Celeste?
Yeah, so that is when the tissue in between the rectus abdominis muscles stretches or thins. A lot of times people will say separated, but that's not true. The tissue is just stretching and thinning. And it's possible that there can be a tear in that tissue and that causes a hernia, but typically it's just abdominal separation. And this is 100% occurring in pregnant women by the time they're 35 weeks pregnant. So it definitely happens no matter what. I do think strengthening core exercise, I do think that doing core exercises during pregnancy can help minimize how wide of a separation they get and whether they're controlling pressure pretty well when they're doing exercises. That can help minimize it. But regardless, it's going to stretch. And this is a normal occurrence for pregnancy. It's not something to fear. And then just to know how to manage it postpartum, how to strengthen all those muscles, learn how to control pressure and get all your strength back and be able to get back to any exercise.
So that's actually really interesting. I've always assumed it literally separates, because I think that's what we get taught at undergrad school.
Right.
You know, there's a separation of the abs. Okay. But it would make sense that, no, the fascia is still intact between the muscles components, but it's just stretched. So over time, what percentage, or, you know, do they all rebound? Is there always a return or a narrowing of the gap, or does it, in your experience, can it stay, or?
Yeah, the research shows that within a few months postpartum, about 60% of women can still be dealing with a larger separation. Technically, diastasis recti is about 3 finger widths or more. But we found that it's really not so much about the width. It's about the tension that you can generate in that tissue and the strength that you can get back in that tissue. So even if it does not close, or, you know, quote, close, there does have to be some, you know, about 1 finger width in between those rectus abdominis muscles. But as long as that tissue can regain strength and maintain the pressure, then it's doing its job, even if it's a little wider than it used to be. So
it's all about pressure, being able to control the pressure. And you use that phrase there about controlling pressure through exercise. Can you just, we're still looking at these myths and unpacking them, but what does that actually mean, controlling pressure through exercise, Celeste?
Sure. So for the normal population, when you engage your core or you lift something heavy, pressure is contained within that abdominal wall. And we do want to create high levels of intra-abdominal pressure to create stability in the spine and be able to create more force, right? And if that wall, the fascia is weaker, right, and the muscles are weaker because they've been stretched out, they have a much more difficult time containing that pressure. And so you get bulging, or you just don't have that stability because the muscles aren't as stiff and strong as they were before, right? So learning how to strengthen the transverse abdominis muscle really well, load it really well, strengthen the rectus abdominis, the other muscles as well, they all need to be strengthened postpartum. And it used to be, 10 years ago when I started, it was, if you have DR, you should just do some TVA isometrics and move on. And that was what the approach was. I started Recore because I was like, look, all the muscles have stretched for 9 months. We can't just ignore all these muscles and just focus on the transverse. Although doing isometrics is important in the initial stage, but it needs to be loaded. And so a lot of times women can just do isometrics and kind of wake up those muscles, but not really load it very well. And so they don't strengthen that transverse abdominis muscle very well. And it takes a long time. It'll happen eventually as they lift heavy, as they do harder exercises, it will strengthen. But I have found that if women specifically work on loading and challenging that transverse muscle along with all the other core muscles, that the recovery is a lot smoother and faster.
And the ability to have appropriate pressures is regained as a result.
Right.
While they're exercising.
Right. And I was going to say, I use a drop test with women. I started doing this about 6 years ago. You've got the double leg lift, which is extremely difficult to do if your core muscles are not working very well. So if women are laying on their back, laying supine, and they have their feet up in the air, and they engage that transverse muscle and slowly lower those legs, they are trying to maintain pressure, contain the pressure and control their spine, keep it stable. And so I do that really early on with them postpartum, and they just only do what they can manage, which is, not very far at all. Yeah. And by the end of the 6 weeks program, I do have a 6-week program. I'll work longer with some people for sure. But at the end of 6 weeks, they redo that test and they can feel themselves how much stronger their core is, how much lower they can lower those legs while still engaging those muscles.
Great test or assessment item to be able to show people their progress and their deficits as well at the start.
Right.
And so simple. That's brilliant, Celeste. Just off the back of those comments around debunking this myth that rectus diastasis or separation of the abs requires surgery and can't be improved. We're discussing controlling pressure then, but you also mentioned that these abdominal muscles don't just need the isometric exercises, they also need to be loaded, so obviously challenged. One of the things that I certainly know we got taught as undergraduate physiotherapy students, and I'm talking 15 years ago, so obviously the field's evolved a lot, but is, well, postpartum, it's as simple as doing some pelvic floor exercises, which typically are isometric holds, in very simple terms, pulling the pelvic floor up, stopping the flow of urine as a crude example. But in my mind, I'm like, how does that ever bridge someone that wants to get back to CrossFit or back in the gym or, whatever it may be? Like, there's a big difference from stopping the flow of urine to doing a deadlift or a squat, which we want people to return to, right?
Right. And those isometrics are important at first. And then we teach women to engage both at the same time, the core and pelvic floor, which does really help control pressure, keeps the pressure off the pelvic floor. So just kind of helps waken the muscles up and strengthen them. And then what's really important for the pelvic floor is things like strengthening the adductors and the glutes and starting to do impact drills. So low impact drills help that pelvic floor become more voluntary, involuntary response, because the leaking happens when the pelvic floor, the coordination is not there. So the leaking is either coordination issue or a strength issue, but you can have a strong pelvic floor, and if it's not coordinating well with your breathing, then you can have leaking issues. So it's really important to just slowly introduce the body to impact. And it's like that pelvic floor muscle has a threshold too, right? So it fatigues at a certain point and it just does not hold the bladder as well. So just slowly introducing to impact is another really important piece to being able to run without leaking and be able to return to higher impact, sprinting, running drills, jumping.
So just a staged return, but the takeaway that I'm getting there is that these muscles have to be challenged. It will not be enough to just stay doing pelvic floor isometrics or ab isometrics. You need to get progressively challenged.
Yeah, and sometimes for like a general population, if they're not into running, it's not as big of a deal.
Yep.
But someone who wants to run or run long, someone who wants to jump, and someone who wants to sprint, it's going to require a lot more coordination and pelvic floor endurance.
Yeah, robustness. You talk about the basic postpartum building blocks, Celeste, being regaining motor control. So is that synonymous with coordination in simple terms?
Yeah, yep. Getting the breathing mechanics down again, because women were pregnant and baby's kind of shoving your diaphragm, stretching things out. So it really is just getting the body to breathe in a relaxed state again, and do the diaphragmatic breathing. Yeah. Start there and then build from there. So basic building blocks are starting with the inner core, which is diaphragm, pelvic floor, TVA, and multifidus. And then outer core muscles, definitely working all of the outer core muscles, glutes as well, adductors. And then the third stage, introducing weights, full body core exercises. So trying to get the core to coordinate with the lower body, coordinate with upper body, and then impact drills.
Yeah,
those are the kind of the four things I walk women through.
The building blocks. And time to walk through those building blocks, Celeste, it's obviously going to be individualized. But in general terms, I think you mentioned at the start, might be 6 weeks plus.
Yeah, we'll even, with the doctor's clearance, I'll even start people 2 or 3 weeks postpartum on basic exercises. And when you think about it, women up to 6 weeks, they are having to walk around, carry their child, squat down to a toilet, get up and down. They are having to lift 10 pounds at least. It's only going to benefit them if their core is working better. So at least 2 or 3 weeks postpartum, getting that core to activate and start to strengthen. Do some very simple exercises the first several weeks can really help them function better.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just with the sport pursuits, but just in all the general demands of daily living. Celeste, one of the other myths that you shared there at the top of our time was that women hear or are sometimes told that they should never do a crunch again. Where does that myth come from?
Yeah, it comes from the diastasis recti, fear that if you do a crunch, you're widening the gap or it's too much pressure for the pelvic floor. And, a sit-up is a higher pressure exercise. Crunches are a little higher pressure than something like, a plank. The fear was if you're doing too many crunches or sit-ups, you can widen that separation and not help it heal. But, research has found that, crunches are an important part of loading the tissue. We do have to be careful to make sure they do have that core pelvic floor coordination back before introducing something like crunches. And you don't want to be doing a lot of them right away because of the high pressure. If someone did have pelvic floor problems or prolapse, they would be a little slower to doing something like a lot of crunches or something like that. It's a movement. It's needed. Now, do we need to do hundreds of them? Not necessarily. I don't do sit-ups, but, crunches are very functional. Sitting up is functional. And women have so much trouble getting out of bed.
Yeah. I was about to say, well, there's your crunch every morning, isn't it? Just trying to get out of bed. So to say that to never do them again is a long stretch. And similar to the planks, you mentioned there's this fear of planking. I was thinking that some of this mythology is around increasing that downward pressure on the pelvic floor. Certainly you hear that a lot. Women either advised to stay away from a gym or told that it won't be good for them, and obviously sometimes it's people's interpretation. But can you speak to that, the return to resistance training? And for those that want to lift heavy, we might have, not just females, but males, for example, that need to do heavy load in squats and deadlifts for their bone health if they've got some lower density. There's groups that need to be lifting heavy-ish, and yet it seems like there's conflicting opinion around what that does to pelvic floor function. Yeah,
definitely. Lori Forner, she did some research on lifting heavy and prolapse, found that lifting heavy was not any worse for prolapse and actually helped improve symptoms. And I think lifting is one of the, you can manipulate your breathing. And if someone did have some symptoms, they can kind of manipulate the pelvic floor a little bit to help with any symptoms sometimes. And so I think it's just helping strengthen the tissues. Obviously, you don't just start lifting heavy. Obviously, you work your way up, but they've found that it's not causing prolapse, right? And even running itself is not causing prolapse. Prolapse happens from birth, from using vacuums and forceps, and it's just the genetic tissue makeup that people have that will bring on some of those symptoms. And that it's not necessarily about what grade prolapse they have, it's what symptoms do they have. So someone with grade 2 can have less symptoms than someone with grade 1, and it's just a matter of strengthening and managing and improving. The symptoms improve once you slowly adapt to the impact.
Yeah, which just makes sense. It just makes sense.
And so there's so much fear of running if you have prolapse, and you do need to strengthen that tissue and help improve those symptoms. Obviously not do too much too soon. It's definitely a possibility to worsen the prolapse if you just go right out and run postpartum without strengthening anything. But I had prolapse. I've been running 10 marathons in the last 6 years, and I've never had a problem. So running is not making anything worse.
Yeah. It sounds like you've got to be symptom-led and use a progressive approach and try and stick within your tolerance zone, but that should inflect upwards over time. Right.
It's just like running, you've got your anaerobic threshold. You've got your pelvic floor threshold. You're just slowly increasing that threshold, just like we do with runners.
Yeah, wow, beautiful. And I think one of the key things I took this there, Celeste, as a learning is that running and heavy lifting do not cause prolapse. These are prolapses as a result of potentially genetic tissue quality and the birthing process itself.
Yeah.
You published a great post recently. I smiled because I think it was just very well written. And I'm just going to read out the post. It was a quote. It said, "Trying to lift your pelvic floor while running is like trying to run with a tight fist. Don't do it." Can you explain a little more? Because I imagine many people have tried to pull their pelvic floor up when they're running.
Yeah.
Men and women.
It has been a common piece of advice from pelvic floor PTs. It used to be to engage that pelvic floor and help improve any incontinence symptoms. But obviously, we know that pelvic floor has to be reactive when you're running, and it needs to be your body needs to be relaxed. If we're physically trying to contract any muscle, right, we're wasting energy. And I just, growing up running track, that was like a common phrase, right? Don't clench your fists when you're sprinting, right?
Yeah.
And so I was just like, it is just like that. Like, why would you waste energy squeezing your fist and trying to squeeze a muscle while you're running? It's not gonna work.
I feel very liberated just on a internal processing point of view from my undergraduate days, Celeste, where people were being cued to activate, in brackets, transverse abdominis before a lift and do all these sorts of things. And I remember just thinking, but wouldn't it just work when you go and pick up that dumbbell?
Yeah.
Like, surely you don't have to consciously recruit muscles when you do something. But does this maybe my interpretations have gone too far, but is there ever a need? I assume there would be on this continuum getting back to this autonomous type of function, but is there a need ongoing for people even lifting or doing Pilates to pull their pelvic floor up all the time?
Well, I think there's a period of time where it's really helpful in strengthening everything and helping the brain recruit what it wants when it needs, right? Because if the strength's not there, it's difficult for it to be used properly, right? So I do feel like there's a period where I do cue them to engage the core, pelvic floor through some smaller movements. But when it comes to heavy lifting and when it comes to something very reactive like running or jumping, or your brain doesn't have time to process that, right? Like we're training outside so that it will perform properly when you're performing, right?
Yeah.
So we know that there are some breathing mechanics that lifters will use or practice to help them. So I think in lifting, sometimes it's helpful, but I know what you're saying, because there is a big debate about, do we engage that transverse when we lift? Do we not? And when it comes to heavy lifting, I do like to teach the typical bracing, cue, getting that air in your abdominal cavity. But I do feel like there's a place to engage that transverse and load it so it can strengthen and shorten. And so if people don't do that, it does take a long time for it to strengthen.
Yeah, great. But then to need to do it for the rest of their days.
Right, yeah. No.
I think there's something missing sometimes in translation.
Right, for sure.
You're listening to this expert edition featuring US-based medical exercise specialist Celeste Goodson on all things postpartum return to sport. Support for today's show comes from the fantastic team and wonderful product over at Earshot's Bluetooth magnetic headphones. As I mentioned at the top of the show, these headphones are not for anyone. They are for runners and cyclists on-road and off-road who charge. Earshot's headphones were forged in the heart of New Zealand's national parks, where training for the T42 adventure race, co-founder and CEO James Bell Booth became frustrated by the constant distractions of his headphones dislodging and falling out. Can anyone relate? Earshot's Bluetooth headphones utilise an innovative, first-of-its-kind proprietary magnetic ear clip design to ensure the headphones can withstand the sharp shocks, speed and functional movements of action sports. But perhaps my favourite feature of the Earshot's headphones is that they have 20 hours of charge. No more losing charge after 3 or 4 hours on a long training session. Now, the great folk at Earshots Headphones are giving listeners the opportunity to win a set of Earshots headphones every month for the next 3 months. Now, to go into the draw, you need to jump over to Pogo Physio's show notes, and there you'll find the link to enter your details and go into the draw to win these awesome headphones. Now, if you would like to pick up your own set of Earshots headphones and not wait for your chance to potentially win a set, then the good news is the team have offered you 10% off the retail price of $169.75 by simply using the coupon code TPPS at checkout. Support for today's show also comes from the Physica Performance Show's very own Learnings membership. Over the years, we've had requests on how people can practically help the support of the show. So we turned on Patreon supported, and the Learnings membership is really simple. If you'd like to support the production of the show from just $5 per month, you can do so over at Patreon simply by searching the Physica Performance Show. There you can pledge your support, and in return, we'll grant you access to all of our upcoming and past live stream events, normally ticketed at $49 per person per event. Last year, we hosted Dr. Stephen Seiler around all things polarized training, and of course, Dr. Shona Halson around all things optimizing recovery. They were very popular events, and in 2021, we're excited to announce that we have 2 live stream events coming your way. One with the upcoming date featuring UK-based, very popular sports dietitian Rinny McGregor on all things fueling for endurance sport. And then later in the year, we'll be bringing you a psychological deep dive with very popular guest Rory Darkins on all things positive psychology for endurance athletes. Now, a massive thanks to this week's Patreon, Neil Matthews, for your support. Neil, thank you for your practical contribution to the show. And of course, support for today's show, as always, is brought to you by Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, then our 45-minute online consultations are effective for any of those conditions. Join athletes worldwide, interstate throughout Australia, getting back to their physical best via online telehealth consults. It's simple. We can diagnose things remotely. It might seem surprising. Prescribe you with the correct exercises, both gym or home-based, and provide you with an appropriate return to run program. To schedule your 45-minute online telehealth consultation with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team, jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Celeste Goodson, on all things postpartum return to sport on this expert edition. Celeste, you've done quite a bit of research around, I find this fascinating, how pregnant women move differently. And you've teamed up with one of our much former loved experts, Max Paquette, around some of the forces that women experience. Can you speak to some of these? You did a great little post about summarising how women do move differently. What are some of the key differences to when women aren't pregnant?
So this research, I have someone working for me now, and she is a research running biomechanist, and she put this article together, but she took all the sources of what's happening in the body during pregnancy, musculoskeletal changes, about reduced stride length, less restricted hip extension, but, women are using a lot of their glutes though, and calves and hamstrings. It just makes sense that you start to see what the body is doing to accommodate for the belly that's growing.
Yeah.
And how that changes their gait. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just helps you understand what we need to be strengthening and working on while you're pregnant.
Postpartum, it makes sense. I mean, obviously, one of these findings that your team yourself published there were, everyone sees it, but the increased pelvic tilt, obviously, the pelvis has to do that.
Right.
But then I think, obviously, postpartum, there's certain exercises that can probably help people with readjusting the pelvic position.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's what's important is we are physically working on re-strengthening and getting those muscles back to a more balanced position, then they're just going to be running smoother, faster, or sooner. Right. Yeah. As long as we can let nature kind of take its course and slowly let their bodies kind of adapt. But I think when they're working on it, just improves a lot better. And that's just what we're kind of missing in the research right now. A lot of the research will look at how is your core strength 3 months, 6 months postpartum compared to a normal population, but it's not necessarily looking at someone who really worked at their core, how much better off they are. Because I do have some elite athletes that are doing some amazing things postpartum, 4 months, 4 months postpartum, 5 months postpartum. And obviously you have to have a less complicated delivery for that to happen and have the right kind of scenario. But I do think things are possible when your body is able to strengthen properly.
Celeste, as you mentioned, you do work with various elite athletes in sport across different sports. What do you see the elite athletes or the high performers struggle with the most postpartum? Yeah,
that is the number one thing I see, which it can vary. It's not the same with everyone, but the most common thing I see is being able to control pressure better, is the lack thereof. And so I'm run them through some tests, and maybe they've already done some of their core exercises. They've already been doing some strength training, but they can tell that it's still a struggle to do a pull-up. It's still a struggle to do a hanging leg raise. It's still, they can do planks, but they're challenging. And so walking them through the drop test, assessing them, typically they just never loaded that transverse abdominis very well. And so it's still not very strong, and just being able to manage pressure very well. Or they just didn't do many impact drills. And so they went from running, which is fine. Maybe they handled running okay, but it's the sprinting that's hard, or it's the jumping that's hard. And so working with them on impact drills, low impact drills, is really helpful.
So the importance of that stage progression, once again, no one gets away without doing a stage return by the sounds of it, whether someone's well-trained or not.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like, everyone will progress through it differently, depending on their level of symptoms. But the progression really is the same. You just make sure everything's working well, right? And strengthen everything. And some people need a little more with their transverse. Some people need a little more with the rectus abdominis. And some really need pelvic floor impact drills.
Yeah. So once again, there's no recipes, but it's individualized. Celeste, this might be a wild assumption, but is there any evidence to support women that have well-trained abdominals doing, I hesitate to even say doing better, but maybe recovering differently or faster on the other side of delivery?
Yeah, I do feel that their strength comes back pretty quickly. One, they're working on it. Two, the muscle memory, I do think that plays a part. I have some elite athletes that I have one that's 4 months post and she's doing 3 pull-ups already. Like I can't do 3. I can do like 1. I can do 1 pull-up. She's doing 3 pull-ups at 4 months postpartum. So she obviously did training during pregnancy to be able to keep up her arm and shoulder, back strength, but that core has a lot to do with it too. And getting that core strength back plays a big part.
And benchmarks, you mentioned like the drop test is a great assessment item for women to see the change over time, the improvement with their ability to control pressure and exert force, etc. Are there benchmarks that in general terms might help the listeners if they're, just wondering, it's going to be individual, but should people be able to hold a plank for 15 seconds or 30 or a side bridge, or, are there any sort of little handy home assessment items that you might suggest as a bit of a way of getting a bit of an idea?
Yeah, I guess I would say I do like to run people through the drop test. Can you engage your transverse and keep that spine in neutral or just immobile? I think it's okay. It moves slightly, right? It doesn't have to be perfectly in neutral, but, hold it steady, lower those legs all the way to the ground, see if you can come back up. For a normal population, an athlete, that's going to be fairly easy for them. Someone who's a normal population but not an athlete, that is going to be challenging for them. And a postpartum woman, it could be pretty challenging for them. Side plank strength, I don't necessarily do tons of endurance with them, but 30 seconds to a minute sides and front planks, and then getting them through moving planks, I really like to do.
Moving planks is in planking, but whilst doing things. Is that what you mean? Yep. What's Celeste Goodson's favourite moving plank position? Putting him on the spot.
Side plank position. I love to do, straight arm and straight leg, or the star holding position, right? That one's a fun one, right?
That one is very tough. That's brutal. Celeste, not everyone is going to necessarily find their trajectory smooth and linear and just getting back with time, doing the things you've shared. We'd all gather this just intuitively. So there are times when people may need to engage surgical assistance, etc. Are there any sort of flags, I guess, we'd look for, or people should look for to know when they need to consider an obs and gynae appointment versus to stick on this trajectory of progressing with time? Yeah,
it's definitely, I think it's really important for women to not feel any shame or anything if they either choose surgery or need surgery. If they're having trouble regaining the ability to control pressure, that tissue has a hard time managing it because maybe it is really, really wide or really thin, they can definitely be a candidate for surgery. So seeing a pelvic floor PT, seeing an OBGYN, if they've gone through some exercises and they're still having difficulty, pessaries are helpful for prolapse as well. And if those aren't helping, it's something to look at. It's just really important to talk to a pelvic PT because there are the risks associated with surgeries, and just making sure that they understand the outcomes and what to expect afterwards. But strengthening before surgery is really key. So it doesn't hurt to go through the progression and see how they respond. And I do need to add, I'm not a pelvic floor PT. I do screen and assess clients, and I send them I encourage them to see a pelvic PT in the first place. I think it should be done postpartum, but it's not automatic. So if they have any red flags like pelvic pain, really heavy pelvic pressure, major leaking problems, then I will send them on. If it's mild, I'll work with them, but I encourage them to go see someone and get an official diagnosis for sure.
You're listening to US-based medical exercise specialist Celeste Goodson on this expert edition on all things postpartum return to sport. Now, if you missed last week's episode, it was a featured performer episode featuring long-term listener of the show, New Zealand-based multi-sport champion Dougal Allen. Now, it has received a lot of positive feedback for good reason. Dougal shared so articulately and also interestingly around psychological aspects of performance and what Dougal coined his 3 Ps. Here's a snippet of my conversation with Dougal Allen.
There is a saying, and I have to say I totally agree, that there's no such thing as bad weather, only poor clothing choice. And so on that day I was quite embarrassed because I'd come from this adventure racing background where you sort of pride yourself on being self-sufficient and capable in all conditions, and I just got my clothing choice wrong. I hadn't paid close enough attention to the forecast and just hadn't prepared my clothing options appropriately. So that's a big one. There's no such thing as poor weather, just poor clothing choice. And Dr. Dan Plews obviously shared some really good insights around the preparation phase when going into an extreme climate. And so I think that's something else worth noting, is just how you prepare leading into that day to give you the tools that you might need in the heat of battle.
To enjoy the full episode 269, be sure to jump back and enjoy the episode wherever it is that you enjoy the podcast from. You'll find us over on YouTube now and across all podcast platforms. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest on this expert edition exploring all things postpartum return to sport with US-based medical exercise specialist Celeste Goodson. Celeste, some set questions here. One, I'm just fascinated to hear what your response would be. If you could change one thing about the postpartum landscape worldwide to help women get back to their best, if it could only be one thing, what would it be? Maybe it's a billboard on the side of the highway that people see driving to work. What's the message going to be?
Yeah, I would say go see a pelvic floor PT because it's just not standard. And sometimes women have a hard time even getting a referral, which is kind of discouraging when you think about what their bodies went through. And it's just kind of like, well, you're 6 weeks cleared and, just gradually get back into exercise and there's no guidance whatsoever. And women have a lot of questions, right? Can I do crunches? Can I, when do I run? When do I not run? And I do need to plug the International Return to Run Guidelines written by Emma Brockwell, Tom Goon, and Grania Donnelly. So they put that out 2 years ago. It's incredibly helpful. So, I do know it's improving. OBGYNs are doing a better job of recommending women to do core pelvic floor postpartum, see a pelvic floor PT, gradually work into running, do a run walk. Don't just go run right away, and just gradually introduce the body to impact.
Yeah, brilliant. And we'll publish those guidelines or connect those on the show notes. Celeste, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So I'm curious to know, what is Celeste Goodson's physical challenge going to be?
Let's do the drop test. Engage that core, breathe out and engage that transverse and try to maintain contraction, keep it tight. See if you can lower those legs down and back up without moving the core or the back. Without
moving too much. So just looking to release and a
Obviously,
little bit of.
It doesn't have to be perfect, but holding that position still can be challenging.
And going into some degree of back arch is nothing to poo-poo. Is that correct?
No,
Yep.
It's not.
Brilliant.
It's just more of a challenge for the muscles, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a video would be good too, Celeste. So if you get around there to posting a video, we'll certainly reshare that if that's possible.
Yeah, we can do that.
Celeste, this is another set question, slightly varied from the question 2 questions ago, but that is, if you could help listeners perform at their physical best, just across the board, with one bit of advice from your learnings, both your own journey and also your profession to date, what would that be? One piece of advice to help listeners perform at their best.
Man, there's a lot to pick from. I would say make sure you're recovering from your hard workouts.
Make sure you're recovering from your hard workouts.
And it gets harder the older you are, right? You got to recover a little more. At least I do.
Gosh, and then check your iron levels. That's something that I think you've brought to many people's attention as well, which is fantastic. Celeste, for those that want to find out more about your work, maybe connect with you, where can they go to do so? You're online, you've got online programs, etc. But where's the best place for people to reach out?
Instagram, pretty active there, Recore Fitness, and then the website is recorefitness.com.
Yeah, brilliant. And that's RECORE, recorefitness.com. And I'd encourage everyone to jump over and do follow Celeste on Instagram. It is one of my favorite galleries there. There's always good stuff going up, and that's at Recore Fitness. Celeste, thank you for your contribution to this very important space that strangely seems to have had not a lot of airtime over the years, but hopefully that's changing.
Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you for doing this. See ya.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed Celeste Goodson's share-ins. Now, this conversation, as I mentioned at the top of the show, is appropriate for coaches, athletes, and practitioners. It doesn't get a lot of airtime, but it's a crucial conversation to have. Be sure to follow Celeste over on Instagram at Recore Fitness, RECORE Fitness, all one word. Celeste posts some fantastic material, which I know you'll enjoy. Do check out our Instagram gallery, where we will repost Celeste's drop test that she mentioned there as a great way of assessing people's progression as they regain abdominal strength and control. And for those that may benefit, Celeste has the Fit Splints, her proprietary product for both postnatal and maternity support. Massive thanks to those who are taking podsies. That's a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying at any moment in time and tagging in the show at Physical Performance Show on Instagram. We'll reshare those. They are always a lot of fun. And of course, a huge thank you to those leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. They are always a lot of fun to receive as well. If you'd like to reach out with any feedback, you are most welcome. b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. Let me know what you'd like to see improved, any particular guests that you'd like to hear featured on the show, or any general feedback. It's always appreciated. If you'd like to support the production of the show, don't forget you can do so over at Patreon. Just search The Physical Performance Show. There from just $5 per month. Not only will you support the production of the show week in, week out, but you'll also receive free access to our live stream events, upcoming and also past, normally ticketed at $49 per person per event. Another huge thank you to today's show sponsor, Earshot's Bluetooth headphone technologies, for your support of the show. Don't forget, if you're sick of your headphones falling out of your ears or going flat, losing charge on long training sessions, look no further than Earshot's Bluetooth headphones, where you can use the coupon code TPPS for 10% off the retail price of $169.75, or I should say, jump over to Pogo Physio's show notes, enter your details, and be in the draw to win one pair of headphones each month for the next 3 months of the show. Now, massive thanks as always to the great folk who make this show possible week in, week out. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Matthew Walding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep the postpartum return to sport theme going, and we'll bring to you a conversation that I had recently with repeat guest of the show, Jessica Stenson, knee Trengove, Australian dual Olympic marathoner and 2014 Commonwealth Games bronze medalist in the marathon as well. And Jess very openly shares around her own journey postpartum in returning to elite sport. So get set for next week's episode featuring Jessica Stenson, knee Trengove, on a featured performer / expert edition, as Jess herself is a physical therapist. There is lots to learn, the highs, lows and learn-ins coming your way. Until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.